supply chain has been a real issue since COVID-19. A lot of things have gotten worse. So the intent of the presentation really is to talk about how did we get here? What's the current state? What are some ways that you can mitigate? And then where are things looking forward? And then have enough time for a good amount of Q&A. So I figured about half the time for presentation, about half the time for Q&A. So with that, what has the impact of COVID-19 been? Increasing lead times and costs to get electronic components, shortages of raw material, scarcity of skilled labor, and issues with transportation and logistics. So there's many others, but those are, I would say, the big hitters from what we see in my business. And this is an example, a chart from Data, where you can see the lead times of components are going from 12 weeks all the way to 39, and I've heard these days they can be up to 52 weeks plus lead time. So it may vary depending on the part, it may vary depending on the industry, but the story here is that part lead times are going up dramatically, and if you don't have an ability to manage that, if you don't have a handle on that, it's going to have a real impact on your ability to ship product. Okay, the other issue that feeds into these part shortages is raw material issues with raw materials. I picked on copper. This is by no means the only material. Think about wood for homes. The price of wood went up substantially. You couldn't get it. I just ordered windows for my house, and I ordered them in March, and they got here in September. That normally would be a 4 to 6 week lead time. So part shortages and raw material shortages are a big issue. The other dynamic with raw materials is I would say instability, uncertainty. So just recently, China had a hiccup and copper prices are going down. So I think you've got shortages, but also just a lot of uncertainty. And I think some of that uncertainty is due to COVID, and what are the impacts of COVID? How long is it going to last? How fast is it going to go away? And how can people plan? Okay, and then the third aspect is labor shortage, and I would put this in two different pieces. One is, I think, something directly related to COVID, where people got laid off, factories had to run with less people because they had to have distance in between factory workers. People quit, they got COVID, they got ill. But I think there's a bigger underlying trend here as well, especially in the US, where it's just harder to get manufacturing labor, and it's overall more difficult to get skilled labor in factories than it was 10 years, 15 years, 20 years ago. And this is a trend that I see continuing beyond beyond COVID. It's some of it short term is COVID, but I think there's also just a larger trend that is beyond COVID that has to do with the dynamics of the labor market and getting harder to get skilled labor. Okay, and then the other big one is transportation and logistics, and you can see from the picture this happens to be Port of Long Beach, and you can see the container ship stacked up there. So this is quite grim. It's not only Long Beach. I mean, this is kind of happening everywhere, and the price of shipping material has gone up dramatically, which is increasing the price of goods and materials, which is impacting inflation. So that's the big hitters. The last one I didn't put on the front slide, but there is overall an increase in demand in some different industries. One is medical. You think about diagnostics, COVID tests, medical technology, remote health. So there's a big advancement in the automation of medical devices, which is increasing the demand for components. The same is true for infrastructure. You think about how many people are working from home. Everybody working from home at some point is going to need data centers to manage that data. So there's a big expansion of computers at home, is also data centers. And then in parallel, there's been this increase in automotive, a migration from traditional engines, which use less electronics, to now electric vehicles, which are are mostly all electronics, right? I mean, yeah, an EV basically is a computer with a battery, right? I mean, that's a lot more electronics, and then you think, on top of that, LiDAR on other things. So, and then the final big change is 5G, which is this migration from the 4G to 5G technology, which is also increasing demand. So, you think about, on the one side, you've got less components, you've got more challenges with transportation combined with increasing demand from a variety of different industries. That's just not a good situation. And I've heard people say this is as bad that they've seen the supply chain, in their history. Yeah. Okay, so what do you do about it? So I'm going to lay out a few strategies, and again, we can get into more during the Q&A. But if you're an OEM and you're making a product and you're relying on supply chain partners as part of that process, you want to make sure as an OEM that you get involved with all aspects of the supply chain. Just relying on a CM to fix the problem is not enough. You have to be in the weeds. You have to be communicating with distributors. You have to be communicating with your CM. You have to be communicating directly with key component manufacturers and fabrication suppliers. Everybody wants material, especially if you're a smaller outfit and you have less leverage. My experience, and I spent 8 years working in a contract manufacturer, is to some degree the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So if you're squeaking, you're likely going to have a better chance than if you're not. So, understanding what the issues are, and then working direct relationships, trusted relationships, building those key relationships is really critical to to helping you mitigate the risks in some of these component situations. Okay, the other aspect is, if you can't find a part, you're likely going to have to go to a broker buy if you want to ship. And there's a number of risks associated with broker buys. In addition to higher cost, you have to make sure your date codes are lined up. You're not buying expired parts. And the other risk is you don't know where parts are coming from. There could be fake parts, but making sure your parts are tested and verified. If possible, ask for a certificate of compliance to make sure that if you are going through that channel, the parts are going to be good and they're not going to fail when you go into manufacturing. Okay, so those are a few tips on the strategies for managing part shortages. The warning here really is bigger companies. If you go back to 99, 2000, which I lived through, the bigger companies would double and triple book because they didn't want to run out of parts. They wanted to make sure they had material. And at some point, it was a little bit of a bubble. And when that burst, all of a sudden, the whole situation turned the other way. There was a glut of components. So I don't know if and when that will happen, but I do think there's a real likelihood that at some point, maybe it's not this year, maybe it's not 22, maybe it's 2023, maybe it's sometime in 2022. But at some point, if that is happening, there's likely going to be a glut, and things are going to turn rapidly, from a shortage to an overage. Okay, and then the other piece is, how do you manage transportation and logistics? It's costing more money and it's taking more time. So as you plan your production cycle and from manufacturing to dock, you have to make sure you have planned for an increased lead time in those materials to take into account transportation, right? Whether that be a boat or a truck or whatever it's going to be to get the part from the manufacturer all the way to the end customer. Okay, it may take weeks to be able to dock and get offloaded. You saw the pictures I showed earlier. I mean, there's ships that are waiting off in the water that can't get onshore. So even if you have material sitting there, you may not be able to access it until those boats can get onshore and get offloaded. Okay, and it's not just boats in the water, going from Asia here. It's also transportation locally. A lot of truckers have gotten COVID. A lot of truckers quit during COVID. So there's a shortage of drivers right now to transport goods around. So again, all this is, you've just got to spend more time. You got to spend more resources to make sure you know what's happening and you're on top of things. Right, and then that's, I would say, the last two slides were hitting the immediate crisis and what do you do for that. What I'm talking about now is going to be 7 strategies to build a more to mitigate risk as well as build a more resilient supply chain. So first strategy, understand end user market, location, capabilities, politics, and policies. Okay, that's going to help you understand where you want to manufacture. Do you have in-country content, et cetera? So that's, from a very high strategic level, you want to understand that. The next is when you're designing products, you want to, as much as possible, find and identify short lead time parts in the design process. And then once those parts are designed in, you want to stabilize the product before you really scale into volume. Okay. And doing a change in a local or let's say a regional environment is much more challenging than doing it in a volume scale when you're building product offshore. Okay, and then when you're selecting your suppliers, select them carefully. Are they a good fit for your product? Are they a good fit for your technology, culture? Can they scale to meet your needs? Can they support your costs? Can they support your quality? What's their financial stability? Especially through COVID, a lot of companies have had challenges with finances. I remember back in the dot-com bubble, a lot of companies just went out of business. So can they weather a storm if things go the other way? And then what are the right locations? A lot of people have talked about doing more locally. There are new models. One of the models is to bring parts in from offshore and then configure them, do the final assembly locally, and then ship locally. So understanding really the overall picture and selecting the right strategy for your business can go a long way to mitigating risk and developing a resilient supply chain. Where practical, you want to duplicate the sources of supply. So smaller companies, that may not be very easy if you don't have a lot of volume and you don't have a budget. That may not be possible, but certainly as you get into becoming a larger business, having duplicate sources of supply will mitigate risk. And there's a lot of risk out there. It's not just COVID. You've got also now environmental risk. What if there's a flood? What if there's a fire and you're only building at one factory and that factory goes down? That can have a major impact on your business. So communication, very important, especially if you're building outside the US. I would recommend getting a good data management system so you can manage the data, and then having regular people that speak the language. If you have a different language, if you have a language barrier, making sure whoever's communicating is able to speak the language clearly and deal with suppliers overseas. And then think of suppliers as an extension of your business, right? So you want to be talking to them just like you talk to anybody else in your business. You want to have regular supplier reviews at least once a quarter. And again, my experience working in the CM world for a number of years, the best clients were the ones that communicated the most and had feet on the street, kind of coming regularly to the factory, communicating, making sure things were on track. Okay, and when you're looking for manufacturing partners, again, what are some things to look at when you're measuring performance? And these are some of the key factors that I've used, and I would say they're good across the industry. You want to look at quality, you want to look at cost, you want to look at delivery, and you want to look at overall process improvement automation. So, is your manufacturing partner getting better? Is their quality getting better? Is their cost going down? Is their delivery improving? And that's in the spirit of process improvement. Again, continuous improvement. And you want to have these kind of reviews at a minimum once per quarter. You want to have regular conversations on a much more frequent basis. Okay, and I'll end it with team. People are so important when you're running a company. Most important asset, and these days really, really hard to get good people. So if you have good people, keep them. And when it comes to supply chain, understand what types of resources you need. Can you leverage consultants? Do you need to hire full-time? What is the need? What is the skill set? What is the capability? How can you recruit, vet, retain top talent? How do you deal with remote working? I mean, I've seen a lot of people have challenges with manufacturing being done in Malaysia, manufacturing being done in China, Taiwan, and they can't go visit the factory now, because in order to go visit, you've got to quarantine for 14 days when you go there, and then you got to quarantine another 14 days when you come back. So it becomes very impractical to just take a quick trip and fly back and forth. It's just not easy to do, at least in the, in the current COVID situation. So how do you deal with that? Can you find resources in country to manage for you? How does remote development impact your development environment? How do you onboard people when you're interviewing remotely and they may be working remotely? How do you maintain team motivation when people aren't on a regular basis working in the same quarters and communicating together? How can you enhance collaboration with a remote workforce?